What if the most brutal thing a prison ever did to a man wasn't the cell, the guards, or the violence? What if it was breakfast? Most people hear prison food, and they think bad. Tasteless, cheap, maybe a little disgusting. That's not what this is. What you're about to hear is something the American prison system has spent over a century quietly burying. Not in files, not in court records, in kitchens. Because here's what they figured out early. You don't need chains to break a man completely. You don't need isolation. You don't need violence. You just need to control what he eats. How much, when, and for how long. Do that long enough, and something inside him stops working. Not his body. Not first anyway. His mind. One prison served the same gray, tasteless paste every single day for months. No flavor. No smell. Nothing to look forward to. Guards called it practical. The psychiatrist who examined survivors called it systematic psychological erasure. One prison weaponized meal timing so precisely that within 3 weeks, grown men were waking up at 2 a.m., drenched in sweat, heart pounding, not from nightmares, from conditioned fear of missing a meal. And number 15 on this list, that one is different. That one will sit with you. Because that prison didn't serve terrible food. It served normal food. Almost generous. 3 meals. Decent portions. And what it did to those men was worse than anything else on this list. 15 prisons. 15 foods. One pattern that connects all of them. A pattern that was never accidental, never random, and never once investigated the way it should have been. Stay until number 15, because by the time you get there, you won't be thinking about prison anymore. You'll be thinking about every institution that has ever controlled what you eat, when you eat, and what happens to you if you don't comply. Before we get to the list, you need to understand one thing, because if you don't, every item on this list will feel like a history lesson. And this is not a history lesson. Here is what this video is actually about. Every single food on this list was a decision, made by a person, sitting at a desk, with options in front of them. They chose this, not because budgets were tight, not because supplies ran low, not because nobody knew better. They chose it because it worked, and that is the question that should keep you up at night. Not what they fed these men, but why it was so effective. Because here is what a century of American prison history proves, and what psychology has confirmed over and over again. Food is not just fuel. Food is identity. Food is rhythm. Food is the one thing, even in the worst circumstances, that reminds a human being they are still human. Take that away. Corrupt it. Control it. Strip it of every quality that makes it feel like nourishment. And you don't just starve a body. You dissolve a person. And the most dangerous part? You could do it completely legally, quietly, with paperwork that calls it a dietary program. That is what every prison on this list understood. That is what every food on this list was designed to exploit. So as we go through these 15 items, don't think about food. Think about control. Think about what it means when an institution decides that the people inside it deserve to feel less than human. And think about how easy it was, how accepted it was, how long it lasted. Because the first item on this list starts in the 1800s. And the last one, number 15, is not as far in the past as you want it to be. Let me ask you something. If someone walked up to you on the street and told you they had found a way to break a human being completely, destroy their sense of self, eliminate their will to resist, remove their ability to think clearly, without touching them once, you would call that person a monster. But what if that person was wearing a suit? What if they had a government contract? What if what they discovered was already being used in over 30 American states? Here is the question at the center of this entire video. Were these food systems accidents of poverty and neglect? Or were they tools, deliberately designed, carefully maintained, quietly defended by the institutions that built them? Because here is what the evidence shows. When researchers finally got inside these prisons, when they documented the diets, measured the outcomes, interviewed the survivors, they didn't find chaos. They found consistency, the same patterns, across different prisons, different states, different decades, the same results every single time. Men who lost weight, they never recovered. Men who developed psychological conditions that had no name yet. Men who walked out of those prisons and could not, for the rest of their lives, sit at a table and eat a normal meal without their hands shaking. That kind of consistency doesn't happen by accident. That is a system working exactly as intended. And that is what we are about to walk through together. 15 foods, 15 prisons, starting with the ones that look almost normal. Because that's how every disturbing truth works. It never starts with the worst thing. It starts with something that almost makes sense. And by the time you realize what's actually happening, you're already 15 items deep. Number 1. Cornbread and Fatback, the Southern Chain Gangs. 1870 to 1930. It doesn't sound dangerous. Cornbread, a strip of fatback pork, maybe some black-eyed peas if you were lucky. This was the standard meal for hundreds of thousands of men working America's Southern chain gangs for over 6 decades. And on the surface, almost looks like food. But here's what that meal actually was. Cornbread and fatback together contain almost zero vitamin C. No fresh vegetables. No fruit. No nutritional variety whatsoever. Do you know what happens to a human body with no vitamin C? It starts falling apart. Literally. First the gums. They swell. They bleed. They pull back from the teeth. Then the joints. The pain starts quiet. A dull ache in the knees, the wrists. Then it becomes constant. Then unbearable. Then the wounds stop healing. A small cut on a man's hand from 12 hours of hard labor would stay open for weeks. Infected. Rotting. This is scurvy. A disease that had been understood and preventable since the 1700s. And these men were getting it in the 1920s. Not because nobody knew better, because fresh vegetables cost money. And these men, in the eyes of the system, were worth less than the cost of a lemon. They worked them until their bodies broke down, fed them just enough to keep them moving, and called it a meals program. That is how this list starts, with something that almost looks like food. Number 2, watered-down Gruel, the 19th century penitentiaries. Before chain gangs, before prison farms, there were the penitentiaries. And inside those stone walls, in the 1800s, men ate gruel. If you don't know what gruel is, it is grain boiled in water until it becomes a thin, pale liquid. No seasoning, no texture, nothing to chew. Just warm gray water with something floating in it. Once a day, sometimes twice. That was it. The Quakers who designed the early American penitentiary system believed that silence, isolation, and simple food would lead men to repentance, to reflection, to God. What it actually led to was psychosis. Researchers who studied survivors of these early institutions found something that stunned them. The men weren't just malnourished. They were mentally shattered. Months of silence combined with a diet that gave the brain almost none of what it needs to function. No healthy fats, no adequate protein, no nutrients that support cognitive function. Produced men who could no longer hold a conversation, could no longer follow simple instructions, could no longer remember their own names in some cases. The Quakers called it penitence. The doctors called it induced cognitive collapse. Same bowl, same gray liquid, every single day. And the worst part? This was considered the humane option. Number 3, spoiled meat, Andersonville Prison Camp, 1864. Now we move to something darker. Andersonville, Georgia, 1864. The most notorious prison camp in American history. At its peak, Andersonville held over 32,000 Union prisoners of war in a facility designed for 10,000. And the meat they were given, when they received meat at all, was spoiled, not slightly past its prime, not a little off, rotting, crawling, green in places. Men were given a choice that wasn't really a choice. Eat the rotting meat or eat nothing. Most ate it, and what followed was one of the most documented cases of mass food-induced suffering in American history. Dysentery tore through the camp like fire. Men who had survived battlefields, men who had charged cannons, were dying on the ground for what they had eaten for breakfast. Nearly 13,000 men died at Andersonville. In 14 months, the commandant, Henry Wurz, became the only Confederate officer executed for war crimes after the Civil War. But here is what the trial revealed that most history books skip over. The spoiled meat wasn't a supply problem. There were records, requisitions that were ignored, requests for fresh food that were denied at the administrative level. Someone made a decision, and 13,000 men paid for it with their lives. Number 4. The single vegetable diet, early reformatories. 1880 to 1910. Here is where it starts to get strange. The reformatory movement of the late 1800s was supposed to be progress. These were not prisons. They were institutions designed to reform young offenders, to rehabilitate, to correct, and their approach to food reflected that philosophy. Single vegetable diets. One reformatory in the Northeast fed its inmates almost exclusively boiled turnips for extended periods. Another used cabbage. Another used dried beans. The logic, and there was logic, was that simple food created simple minds. Uncomplicated, controllable, less likely to be distracted by pleasure or desire. Strip away the enjoyment of eating, and you strip away a layer of the self that causes trouble. That was the actual theory, written down in official documents. What they produced instead was a generation of young men with severe developmental deficiencies. Growing bodies deprived of protein, healthy fats, and essential vitamins during critical developmental years don't just get sick. They don't develop properly. Bone density, brain function, emotional regulation, all of it stunted permanently by a diet that someone with a philosophy degree decided was good for the soul. These were children, and someone decided turnips were enough. Stop. Before we continue, I need you to notice something. Because if you missed it, the rest of this list won't hit the way it should. Look at what we just covered. Scurvy from a diet any 18th century sailor could have told you was dangerous. Cognitive collapse from gruel that the people serving it knew wasn't enough. 13,000 men dead from meat that records show was deliberately left to rot. Children fed single vegetables by people who wrote down in official documents that they were doing it on purpose. None of these were accidents. Every single one had paperwork behind it. Every single one had a person, sometimes multiple people, who reviewed the diet, understood the consequences, and signed off anyway. And here is the thing that should disturb you most. Every single one of these systems was defended. Not quietly, not nervously, publicly, confidently, by officials who stood in front of reporters, in front of courts, in front of God, and explained why this was necessary, why this was appropriate, why the men eating this food deserved exactly what they were getting. That is not neglect. Neglect looks away. This looked directly at the suffering and called it policy. Now here is the question you need to carry with you into the next section. If this is what they did openly in the early years when the system was still being built, what did they do once they got better at it? Because items 5 through 9 are not about the 1800s anymore. These are closer, much closer. And the people who designed them weren't working from ignorance. They were working from everything they had already learned. Number 5, the gray paste, Eastern State Penitentiary. 1920 to 1930. Eastern State Penitentiary. Philadelphia. once the most expensive building ever constructed in the United States, built to break people quietly, and the food they served matched the architecture perfectly. A gray paste, thick enough to hold its shape on a spoon, thin enough to swallow without chewing, made from boiled oats, rendered fat, and whatever grain was cheapest that week. No seasoning, no variation, no color. Every meal, every day, for months at a time. Now here's what most people don't understand about sensory deprivation through food. The human brain is wired to anticipate pleasure, especially around eating. The smell of food triggers dopamine before the first bite. The variety of flavors keeps the brain engaged. The ritual of a meal, the texture, the temperature, the experience, tells the brain that life still has something worth paying attention to. Remove all of that, completely, consistently, for long enough, and the brain stops anticipating, stops engaging, stops producing the chemicals that make a person feel connected to their own life. Psychiatrists who studied Eastern State survivors decades later found something that had no clinical precedent at the time. Men who had been fed the gray paste for extended periods showed the same neurological markers as people who had undergone prolonged sensory isolation. Not similar markers, the same ones. The food wasn't just tasteless. It was a tool for disconnecting a man from himself. And the people running Eastern State knew exactly what they were doing because they had studied the results. And they kept serving the paste anyway. Number 6. Controlled meal timing, Stateville Correctional Center, 1930 to 1950. Stateville, Illinois, run for decades by one of the most controlled and deliberate prison administrators in American history. And his approach to meal timing was unlike anything that had come before. Meals at Stateville were served at precise intervals, not approximately, precisely, the same time every single day, to the minute. Guards synchronized watches. Any deviation, any delay, was documented and investigated. On the surface, this sounds like discipline, organization, efficiency. It was none of those things. What it actually was behavioral conditioning, straight from the psychological research of the era. Here is what happens when you eat at the exact same time every day for months under conditions of extreme stress. Your body stops regulating hunger naturally. Instead, it outsources that regulation entirely to the clock, to the external signal, to the institution. Men at Stateville stopped feeling hungry at random times. They only felt hungry at meal times. And when meal times were occasionally shifted deliberately as a punishment, the psychological response was immediate and severe. Anxiety, disorientation, in some cases, full panic attacks, from a meal being moved by 30 minutes. That is not a coincidence. That is a nervous system that has been successfully rewired. The institution had taken one of the most basic human biological functions, hunger, and transferred ownership of it from the man to the prison. They didn't just control when he ate. They controlled when he felt human. Number 7. Salt deprivation, Louisiana State Penitentiary. Angola, 1940 to 1960. Angola, Louisiana, 18,000 acres. The largest maximum security prison in the United States. And for decades, the food served there was deliberately, systematically low in salt. Not no salt, just not enough. And that distinction matters enormously, because complete salt removal is obvious, detectable, documentable, but chronic mild salt deprivation, sustained over months and years, produces effects that are almost impossible to trace back to the food. Persistent fatigue that doesn't respond to sleep. Muscle weakness that appears without physical cause. Cognitive fog that makes concentration feel like pushing through wet concrete. Mood instability that looks like behavioral problems rather than nutritional deficiency. And here's the part that makes Angola's salt deprivation policy genuinely sinister. Every single one of those symptoms, the fatigue, the weakness, the fog, the instability, made the men easier to manage. Tired men don't organize. Weak men don't resist. Foggy men don't file grievances. Unstable men get classified as behavioral problems, not victims of a dietary policy. Angola's administration didn't need to beat these men into submission. They salted them into it. Or more precisely, they didn't salt them enough. And the beauty of it, from a purely administrative perspective, was that nobody could prove anything. It was just food. Number 8. The Starvation Ration, Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, 1934 to 1963. Alcatraz. The name alone carries weight. The island, the water, the reputation. But what most people don't know about Alcatraz, what the movies never show, is the calories. The average male requires roughly 2,000 to 2,500 calories per day to maintain basic physical and mental function. Alcatraz inmates in disciplinary segregation receive between 1,200 and 1,400 calories per day, for weeks at a time, sometimes months. Now understand what 1,200 calories actually means for a grown man. It means his body starts consuming itself within days. First, the fat reserves. Then, when those are gone, the muscle tissue, including the heart muscle. It means his brain, which requires glucose to function, begins rationing its own resources, shutting down non-essential cognitive processes first. Creative thinking, long-term planning, emotional regulation. What's left is a man who can only think about one thing, the next meal. And that, right there, is the mechanism. Because a man who can only think about the next meal is not thinking about escape, not thinking about resistance, not thinking about his rights or his case or the letter he was going to write to his lawyer. He is thinking about food. Alcatraz didn't just use the island to isolate these men. It used hunger to build a second island inside their minds, one they could never swim away from. Number 9. Contaminated food and water, various federal institutions. 1940 to 1950. This one is different from everything before it, because this wasn't about deprivation. This was about what was added. Multiple federal institutions during the 1940 and 1950 were documented in their own internal records, serving food and water with contamination levels that exceeded safe thresholds. Lead in the water pipes running to kitchen facilities. Documented, known, unfixed for years. Pesticide residue on produce, not accidental drift from nearby farms. Produce purchased at the lowest possible price point from suppliers who applied chemicals at levels illegal for public consumption. And in several documented cases, food preparation areas with mold contamination that was reported by kitchen staff, logged by administrators, and left unaddressed for months. Here is what chronic low-level lead exposure does to a human brain. It doesn't kill quickly. It degrades. Slowly. Consistently. It reduces impulse control, increases aggression, impairs the ability to make long-term decisions. And when men in these institutions became more aggressive, more impulsive, more difficult to manage, the institution's response was not to check the water. It was to increase the punishment. They were poisoning these men and then punishing them for the symptoms. I need you to stop for a moment, because we are halfway through this list. And if you're still thinking about food, you're missing what this video is actually telling you. Look at what we have covered so far. Diets that caused scurvy, a disease with a known cure since the 1700s. Gruel that collapsed men's minds. Rotting meat that killed 13,000 people. Children fed single vegetables by people who wrote the philosophy down. Gray paste engineered to disconnect men from their own consciousness. Meal timing weaponized to rewire the nervous system. Salt deprivation calculated to produce fatigue and compliance. Starvation rations designed to make hunger the only thought a man could hold. Contaminated food and water that increased aggression, followed by punishment for that aggression. 9 items, 9 different institutions, 9 different decades, one identical outcome. Men who were easier to control. And here is the midpoint truth that this entire video has been building toward. None of this required violence. None of this required a guard raising a hand. None of this required a warden issuing a brutal order. None of this left marks that showed up in an autopsy. It was all completely legal. It was all completely deniable. And it was all completely intentional. Because here is what a century of American prison food policy actually reveals about power. The most effective control system ever designed doesn't look like control. It looks like a meal program. It looks like a budget decision. It looks like institutional efficiency. It looks like something nobody would ever investigate. Because who investigates food, that is the genius of it. And that is the horror of it. Because the people who designed these systems understood something profound about human psychology. A man who is beaten knows he is being attacked. He can resist that. Mentally, emotionally, he can hold onto his identity, his sense of self, even while his body suffers. But a man whose food has been quietly, systematically corrupted, he doesn't know what's happening to him. He just knows he feels wrong, tired, foggy, weak, anxious, less than himself, and he has no one to blame. No moment to point to, no visible wound to show, just a slow erosion of everything that made him a person. That is not punishment. That is something else entirely. And the 6 items remaining on this list, they are not from the 1800s. They are not from the distant past. Some of them are still happening, in facilities that exist right now, in a country that calls itself the most advanced civilization in human history. Number 10, Nutraloaf, multiple state prisons. 1970, present day. This is where the list stops being history. Because Nutraloaf is not something that used to exist. It exists right now, in prisons across America. Today, as you watch this video, here is what Nutraloaf is. Take every food group a human being needs to survive. Vegetables, grains, protein, fat. Compress them all together into a single dense brown brick. Bake it, cool it, serve it on a tray without utensils. Nutritionally, it keeps a person alive. That is the only thing it does. No flavor, no texture worth describing. No distinction between breakfast, lunch, and dinner. No ritual, no experience. Just a brown brick of survival calories served 3 times a day. And here is the official justification. Nutraloaf is classified as a disciplinary measure. It is served to inmates who have been deemed too dangerous to eat with utensils, who have thrown food, who have been disruptive in the cafeteria. That sounds reasonable until you look at the documentation. Because Nutraloaf has been served in documented cases for periods of up to 90 days. 90 days of the same brown brick, 3 times a day. Courts have been asked repeatedly whether Nutraloaf constitutes cruel and unusual punishment. And repeatedly, they have said no, because it keeps the body alive. But here's what those courts never asked. What does 90 days of sensory food deprivation do to the human mind? Psychologists who have studied prolonged Nutraloaf sentences have documented outcomes that are almost identical to the effects of solitary confinement. Anxiety disorders, depression, dissociation, a fractured relationship with food that persists for years after release. One man who served 60 days on Nutraloaf described it this way. He said, by day 30, he had stopped thinking of himself as a person who ate meals. He thought of himself as a machine that was being refueled. That is not a dietary outcome. That is a psychological one. And America's prison system is still producing it. Right now, number 11. Rotten produce as a reward system, Southern state prisons. 1950 to 1970. Most people understand punishment. What they don't understand, what makes this item so psychologically disturbing, is what happens when you weaponize reward. In multiple Southern state prisons during the 1950 and 1970, fresh produce was used as a behavior modification tool. Compliance got you slightly better food. Resistance got you worse. On the surface, that sounds like basic incentivization. Carrot and stick. But here is the detail that changes everything. The baseline, the food given to every inmate regardless of behavior, was already inadequate, already borderline, already producing the fatigue and cognitive fog we covered earlier. So the reward wasn't good food. The reward was slightly less terrible food. And the punishment, the rotten produce given to men classified as non-compliant, was food that was actively harmful, visibly decomposing, documented in some cases to contain bacteria that cause severe gastrointestinal illness. Here is what that system actually does to a human being psychologically. It doesn't just punish bad behavior. It redefines the baseline of what a person believes they deserve. When your reward is food that won't make you sick, and your punishment is food that will, you stop thinking about dignity. You stop thinking about rights. You stop thinking about whether any of this is acceptable. You think about one thing. How do I behave well enough to not get the rotten produce today? That is not rehabilitation. That is the systematic destruction of a person's sense of self-worth. Conducted 3 times a day, with a tray. Just one question. One single question before we get to number 15. Every system on this list, every prison, every diet, every policy was reviewed by someone. A warden, an administrator, a government official, a court, people with educations, people with families, people who went home at night and sat at their own dinner tables and ate meals they enjoyed. Meals that were warm, meals that had flavor, meals that made them feel human. Those same people, the next morning, approved what you just heard. Not once, not by accident, repeatedly, consistently, for decades. And here's what that means. This was never about punishment fitting the crime, because no crime, no matter what it was, requires induced cognitive collapse, requires a nervous system rewired by controlled meal timing, requires the systematic erasure of a man's food memories and cultural identity. No legal framework demands that. No moral philosophy justifies that. So why did it keep happening? Because the people who built these systems understood something about human nature that most of us spend our entire lives avoiding. It is very easy to do monstrous things. When a monster never has to look its victim in the eye, when the monster sits at a desk, signs a document, and calls it a dietary program, that is what every item on this list has in common. Not the food, the distance, the carefully maintained distance between the person making the decision and the person living with the consequences. And number 15. Number 15 is the item that proves that distance is not unique to prisons. It never was. Number 15. The normal meal, scared straight era juvenile facilities. 1980 to 1990. This is the one I warned you about. Not because the food was terrible, because it wasn't. During the scared straight era of the 1980 and 1990, a period when America became obsessed with the idea that exposing troubled youth to prison realities would frighten them into compliance, a network of juvenile detention facilities adopted a specific philosophy. Feed them well. 3 meals a day, reasonable portions, actual variety. Occasionally, something that almost resembled a normal meal a teenager might eat at home. By the standards of everything else on this list, this sounds humane. It was the opposite. Here is what those facilities understood, and what the psychology behind this program reveals about control at its most sophisticated level. When you starve someone, they know they are being punished. When you beat someone, they know they are being punished. When you isolate someone, they know they are being punished. But when you feed someone well, while stripping away every other freedom, something different happens. The mind searches for an explanation, and when it cannot find one, when the body is fed but the soul is still caged, the mind turns inward and starts to believe that the cage is deserved. Psychologists who studied juveniles released from these facilities found something that stopped them cold. These were not kids who came out angry at the system. These were kids who came out believing, deeply, genuinely, without anyone explicitly telling them, that they deserved what had happened to them, that the punishment was just, that the system was fair, because the system had fed them. And in the psychology of a developing mind, care and control had become indistinguishable. That is behavior modification at its most complete. That is control at its most invisible, because it left no marks, produced no obvious trauma, generated no lawsuits, created no documentation of abuse. It just produced young people who had been quietly, efficiently, and completely convinced that the institution knew best, that compliance was safety, that the system, the same system that had locked them up, was also the system that cared for them. Think about what that does to a person for the rest of their life. Not just in prison, outside, in school, in work, in relationships, in every interaction with authority for the next 50 years. A person who learned, at the most formative moment of their psychological development, that the people who control your food control your sense of worth. That being fed means being safe. That the hand that feeds you, regardless of what else that hand does, deserves your loyalty. That is not a prison outcome. That is a lifelong psychological condition, installed deliberately, through breakfast. And here, right here, is where this video stops being about prisons. Because that mechanism, feed them just enough to generate loyalty, control everything else, make them believe the system is benevolent. That is not unique to juvenile detention facilities. That is not unique to the 1980s. That pattern, that specific, deliberate, psychologically sophisticated pattern, exists in every institution that has ever needed compliance from people who had no other options. You have seen it. You may not have recognized it, but you have seen it, and now you cannot unsee it. Let me tell you what you just watched, because it wasn't a list of foods. It was a blueprint that took over a century to build, refined across dozens of institutions, tested on hundreds of thousands of human beings, documented in official records that sat in government filing cabinets, while the men who survived it tried to explain to their families why they couldn't eat a normal meal without their hands shaking. And here's the thread that ran through every single item on this list. Every food, every policy, every system. None of it was random. None of it was neglect. All of it, from the cornbread and fatback on the chain gangs to the carefully normal meals in the juvenile facilities, was built around one fundamental insight about human beings. Control what a person eats, and you control what a person believes about themselves. Their worth, their dignity, their right to resist, their capacity to imagine something different from what they are currently experiencing. All of it flows through the stomach before it reaches the mind. The chain gang administrators knew it. The Quaker Penitentiary designers knew it. The Alcatraz wardens knew it. The Nutraloaf policy writers know it today. And the juvenile facility directors who fed teenagers decent meals while dismantling their psychological autonomy. They knew it most of all because they had learned from everyone who came before them. They had taken a century of brutal, obvious, documentable food abuse, and they had refined it into something invisible, something that looked like care, something that felt like kindness, something that produced the most compliant, the most psychologically dependent, the most institutionally loyal human beings the American correction system had ever seen, and released them back into the world, where they built families, had children, entered workplaces and communities and relationships, carrying, without knowing they were carrying it, a set of beliefs about power, care, control, and what they deserved, that had been installed at a table, with a tray, by a system that understood them better than they understood themselves. That is what this video was about. Not food. Never food. It was about what happens when an institution decides that the people inside it are resources to be managed, rather than human beings to be respected. It was about the distance between the person signing the policy and the person eating the consequences. It was about how the most sophisticated forms of control never announce themselves. They don't arrive with chains. They don't arrive with violence. They arrive with a tray, quietly, 3 times a day, until the person receiving it can no longer remember who they were before the tray arrived. Here is the question I want to leave you with. Not about prisons, about you. Think about the institutions in your life right now. The ones that feed you, literally or figuratively. The ones that provide, that give you just enough comfort, just enough stability, just enough of what you need to keep going. Now ask yourself this. What do they ask for in return? Because here is what a century of American prison food policy actually taught us, if we are honest enough to learn from it. Control has never needed violence to be effective. It has never needed chains. It has never needed walls. It only needs one thing, to make you dependent on it for something you cannot live without. Do that, and it doesn't need to force your compliance. You will hand it over willingly, gratefully, every single day, 3 times a day. The men in these prisons didn't choose their trays, but they ate from them anyway. Because what else do you do when the tray is the only thing being offered? That question is not about prison. It never was. And if something about this video made you uncomfortable, if something about that question lands a little too close, good. That feeling is not paranoia. That feeling is clarity. Hold on to it, because the moment you stop questioning what you are being fed is the moment the tray wins. If this video made you think differently about something, anything, hit the like button. Not for the algorithm, because it tells me this kind of content is worth making more of. And if you want to go deeper, if you want to understand the hidden psychological systems operating inside the institutions most people never question, subscribe. Black Table Archives, because the next video goes somewhere even darker than this one. And I promise you, you are not prepared for what's on the menu.